Welcome, everyone, to a journey back to one of the most pivotal and dissected moments in American history. Today, we are stepping into the worn boots of General James Longstreet, a man whose formidable reputation as Robert E. Lee's Old War Horse became inextricably linked to and forever shaped by the events of July 3, 1863. For generations, his actions at Gettysburg have been the subject of intense debate, often casting him as the reluctant subordinate whose doubts doomed the Confederate effort. But history is rarely so simple. We're going to move beyond the myth and listen to this pivotal moment from his own deeply personal perspective, focusing on the raw, first-hand experience of orchestrating the charge that would become synonymous with the high-water mark of the Confederacy. First, be sure to like and subscribe to WinLink Deep Dive to support our investigative community. The morning had been fraught with tension. I had expressed my grave reservations to General Lee, advocating for a strategic movement to flank the Union Army, to force General Meade to attack our positions on higher ground. But Lee's mind was settled. He believed the spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia, which had triumphed against so many odds, could break the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. The grand artillery barrage that was meant to soften the enemy lines had commenced with a deafening roar, but its effectiveness was an open question. Then came the moment of truth. When General George Pickett, his signature curls framing a youthful, eager face, approached and asked the fateful question, "General, shall I advance?" My heart was a leaden weight in my chest. The effort to speak the command aloud failed, caught in a throat tight with a prescient dread. I could only convey the order with a solemn affirmative bow. It was an assent given not with conviction, but with a soldier's resigned duty to his commanding officer. He took on the task with an air of assured victory, vaulted onto his horse with a theatrical flair that inspired his men, and rode off cheerfully to lead his division in what they all believed would be a glorious war-ending charge. I then mounted and spurred my horse, hurrying to the observation post of Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, the brilliant young artillery officer upon whose judgment the assault's preliminary success so heavily relied. The news he delivered was a cold dash of water, confirming my worst fears. He informed me, his voice strained, that the cannon reserves he had carefully saved to accompany the infantry assault had been spirited away by General Lee's chief of artillery. To make matters worse, the ammunition for our remaining batteries of position was so critically reduced that he could not, in good conscience, promise them as proper support for the advancing infantry. He was told to halt the advance immediately and frantically replenish his ammunition chests. But to our shared and utter dismay, the supply trains were distant. There was no more to be found. The command from General Lee, however, was absolute and allowed for no further delay. The commanding general had fixed his heart and his entire strategy upon this single, decisive objective, believing the Union line was on the verge of collapse. It was at that precise, agonizing moment that we observed through the smoke several of the Union batteries on the ridge hitch their guns and begin to withdraw. This movement offered a fleeting, cruel glimpse of unexpected hope. Was it a ruse, or were they truly battered into withdrawal? We chose to believe the latter. Encouraging, almost frantic messages were sent from the forming columns to hurry the advance, and as they stepped off, they moved with a buoyant, almost elastic, springing pace, their flags unfurled against the summer sky. They began to cover the nearly a mile of open, rolling field that separated them from the enemy. The officers saluted as they marched by our position, their resolute smiles and confident nods communicating a powerful, heartbreaking belief in their imminent success. General Pickett, ever the elegant and dashing horseman, sat easily in his saddle, a picture of martial confidence, his long brown hair resting calmly on his shoulders. To his left, Pettigrew's division, which included many weary and bloodied soldiers from Heth's bloody engagement on July 1st, spread their steps and quickly rectified their alignment, and the entire magnificent, terrible advance, a fighting front nearly a mile wide, pressed on courageously. As the front ranks cleared the path, the supporting units under the command of General Isaac Trimble sprang to their alignments with disciplined precision. General Trimble himself, a fiery and determined officer, mounted his horse, adjusting his seat and reins with a calm demeanor, as if he were merely embarking on a pleasant afternoon ride through the Virginia countryside. The contrast between the pastoral gesture and the hellish landscape was stark. Once the line was properly formed into a formidable fighting front, the solid march proceeded down the slope of Seminary Ridge, passed through our own emplaced batteries, and entered the open valley of death. Our Confederate batteries did what little they could, firing their remaining shells over the heads of our soldiers as they descended, managing for a brief period to attract and occupy the enemy's fire. But soon, the smoke from hundreds of cannons lifted and drifted to the rear, and as the visibility cleared, every Union gun on the ridge was turned upon the exposed blue-clad infantry columns. The batteries that had withdrawn were quickly replaced by fresh, well-supplied ones from the Union's vast reserves, and a storm of iron began to tear into our lines. The visual spectacle was both magnificent and horrifying. Soldiers and officers who moments before had been stepping smartly began to fall. Some fell in heaps to rise no more, their lives extinguished in an instant. Others, clutching shattered limbs, began their agonizing crawl or were helped to the rear, starting their difficult journey to the overcrowded field hospitals. At first, single files were cut down here and there, like scythes taking individual stalks of wheat. Then the gaps in the line started to widen into yawning chasms. An occasional solid shot would tear a wider, more gruesome opening, plowing through entire ranks of men, but with incredible discipline, the survivors would close the breaches as fast as they were made, and the grand march moved inexorably forward into the ever-thickening storm of canister and rifle fire. Seeing the lines begin to waver, I dispatched my staff officer, Colonel Latrobe, to General Trimble with urgent orders to have his men press forward and fill the spaces left by the shattered brigades in the front, and bravely they repaired the damage, stepping over the bodies of their comrades to do so. Simultaneously, we observed the enemy begin to maneuver, sending regiments out against the supporting brigade in Pickett's rear. To counter this new threat, Colonel Sorrell was sent galloping with orders to have that move guarded, and Pickett's attention was necessarily drawn to that new contention on his flank. In a further attempt to relieve the pressure, General McLaws was ordered to press his left forward, but the direct line of infantry volleys and the devastating crossfire of artillery from Little Round Top was telling fearfully on the front of the assault. It was at this critical juncture that the British observer, Colonel Fremantle, thrilled by the sheer pageantry of the charge, ran up to offer his congratulations on the apparent success of our men reaching the stone wall. I could only grimly direct his attention to the broken, struggling ranks that were now being enveloped. Trimble, for his part, mended the battle of the left in handsome style, but on the right, the massing of fresh Union regiments grew stronger and stronger, threatening to overwhelm our dwindling numbers. The cost in leadership was staggering. Within a short span, Brigadier General Garnett, who had chosen to lead his brigade on horseback despite a fever, was killed. Generals Kemper and Trimble were desperately wounded and carried from the field. The Union line was also paying a price. We later learned Generals Hancock and Gibbon were wounded while defiantly directing their troops from the front. Command on the Confederate left devolved to General Lane, who succeeded Trimble and, alongside the wounded but steadfast Pettigrew, held the Battle of the Left in surprisingly steady ranks. But Pickett's lines, being nearer the epicenter of the Union defense, faced the heaviest impact. Most of his field officers were now killed or wounded, leaving companies leaderless. The stories of individual heroism were countless and tragic. Colonel Whittle of Armistead's brigade, a man who had already been shot through the right leg at Williamsburg and lost his left arm at Malvern Hill, demonstrated almost superhuman endurance. In this charge, he was first shot through the right arm and then finally brought down by a shot through his left leg. General Lewis Armistead, a beloved and courageous officer, leading the second wave with his hat held high on his sword point, spread his steps to supply the places of his fallen comrades. His colors were cut down by a devastating volley just as his remnant force reached the low stone wall at the angle, pressing on to engage the bristling line of bayonets on the other side. He put his cap on his sword to guide the final desperate storm, a gesture that became legendary. But the enemy's massing, enveloping numbers held the struggle, and the noble Armistead fell, mortally wounded, beside the wheels of the very enemy battery he had sought to capture. Pettigrew was also wounded, but he held his command, trying to steady his thinning line. General Pickett, seeing the battle was irrevocably broken and the enemy was still reinforcing with unending numbers, made the painful decision to call the troops off. There was no more indication of panic than there had been at the start. The broken files, what was left of them, marched back from that fiery ridge in the same steady step with which they had advanced, though their numbers were but a ghost of the proud force that had stepped off. The effort was nobly made and failed from blows that simply could not be fended. Anticipating a swift Union counterattack across our now open and defenseless field, I rode immediately to the line of our reserve batteries, my mind resolved to hold that final line until the last gun was lost. As I rode, the Union shells, now shifted to target our artillery positions, came screaming over my head, plowing the ground under my horse with terrifying concussions. In that moment of supreme physical and mental exhaustion, an involuntary, almost shameful appeal went up from my soul that one of them might take me from scenes of such awful responsibility. But the counterstorm we had to meet left no time to think of oneself. The battery officers, to a man, were already separated and galloping to meet the crisis. I was heartened to see that no move had been made for leaving the field. Our battered men passed back through the batteries in a quiet, weary walk, and I could see in their set faces that they would rally. I knew they would find their spirit again when they reached the familiar ridge from which they had started just hours before. Yet an eternity ago. General Lee was soon with us, riding out to meet the survivors. His face was a mask of anguish, but his presence was calming. With staff officers and others, he moved among the men, taking all blame upon himself, encouraging them and getting them together, famously telling a distraught General Pickett to see to his division and assuring all who would listen, "It is all my fault." The campaign was over, and the long retreat back to Virginia was about to begin, all hopes of a decisive victory on Northern soil buried forever on the slopes of Cemetery Ridge. If this deep dive into the nuanced and human heart of our past resonated with you, if you felt the weight of command and the courage of the common soldier, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing to WinLink Deep Dive. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover the hidden stories and complex truths of history. Thank you for watching.